There are moments when everything around you seems the same rhythm of the day, the same familiar faces, and yet something inside you is no longer standing still the way it used to. You begin to notice the smallest things, a glance that lingers just a little longer, a presence that no longer feels distant the way it once did. And then a quiet question begins to form. Not to be answered right away, but simply to exist. Could something be shifting? Or maybe you've started to see things differently? There's no need to rush to a conclusion. Some things only become clear when you allow yourself to slow down long enough to truly feel them. Because sometimes, it's within these subtle, almost invisible changes that a new story begins to unfold, in a way you may have never noticed before. There are changes that don't need to be announced. Everything on the outside seems to move in the same familiar rhythm, the same road you walk each day, the same familiar sounds, a world that doesn't rush to change just so you can notice something different. And yet, somewhere deeper within you, something begins to shift, not clear enough to name, not strong enough to make you stop in your tracks, just a feeling. Like standing by the ocean on a windless afternoon. The surface looks still, but if you stay long enough, you begin to notice. The current underneath never really stopped moving. And maybe what you're feeling now is something like that. You start noticing details you once overlooked, a glance that no longer rushes away, a small pause in the way they speak to you, a presence that feels more aware, each as if they're actually there, truly there, instead of just passing through like before. No one says anything, no explanations are offered, and yet you feel it. And the strange part is, you don't have to go looking for it. You're no longer scanning, no longer trying to decode every small action. It prosto appears in your awareness naturally, as if you're seeing things more clearly. Not because the world has changed that much, but because the way you feel has. There's a new kind of quiet in you now, a quiet that isn't filled with doubt or the need to understand everything right away. And within that quiet, you begin to see what you once missed. Maybe they haven't suddenly become a different person. Maybe the story between you isn't starting over in the simple way people often imagine, but the energy, something about it has shifted. And sometimes the smallest changes are the most honest ones. You don't feel the need to react right away anymore. You're not pulled into analyzing every signal. Instead, you observe more calmly, with a little more distance, but also with more depth, like stepping back just enough to see the whole picture, instead of getting lost in every tiny detail. And maybe, what matters most here isn't only about them. It's about you, the way you no longer rush to label everything, the way you allow yourself to feel without needing a conclusion, the way you've come to accept that some things don't have to be understood right away to still carry something real. Something has changed, but this time, you don't feel the need to chase the answer anymore. You simply recognize it, and sometimes all that alone is already a long way from where you used to stand, before any kind of shift ever happened. There was a long stretch of time that only you truly understood, not the kind of journey you could easily explain to someone else, not something you could sum up in just a few sentences. It was made of quiet, personal moments, nights where you lay there, not exactly sad, but no longer at peace the way you used to be. You found yourself wondering if maybe you had seen something the wrong way, if there was something you missed or something you hadn't understood deeply enough. And there were times you wanted to say everything, to explain, to clarify, to be understood the way you felt things inside. But in the end, you chose silence, not because you had nothing left to say, but because you began to realize words don't always bring people closer. Some distances can't be closed with explanations, and some stories, the more you try to hold on to them, the more they pull you away from yourself. So, you stopped, not to give up, but to return to a place you didn't even realize you had left behind, yourself. You started giving your time to the simplest things that didn't need to be seen, didn't need to be validated, just moments where you were alone, but no longer felt empty. You learn to listen to your own emotions without rushing to fix them, to accept that some days you're not okay, and that's still okay. And slowly, little by little, you stopped feeling the need to prove anything. You didn't need to prove you were right. You didn't need to prove you were enough. You didn't need to prove you deserved to stay in someone else's story, because somewhere deep within, you began to understand. Your value was never about whether someone else could see it. It was about whether you could truly see yourself. This change wasn't loud. There was no clear moment where you could say, this is where everything changed. It happened slowly, almost silently, but it stayed. And maybe that's what made it real. Because the shift wasn't in what you said, wasn't in how you tried to show up. It was in the energy you carried with you every single day. A difference others might not understand right away, but somehow they could feel. Because when you stop trying to be seen, you become clearer. Not in your words, but in your presence. And sometimes that quiet, honest presence is exactly what allows everything around you to begin shifting in the most natural way. And then, at some point, a moment you can't quite trace back to exactly when, you stopped, not in a dramatic way, not as some big decision you clearly announced to yourself. Just, you weren't moving toward them the way you used to. You weren't checking if they were still there. You weren't questioning what every small signal meant. You weren't placing yourself in that space of needing to understand, to figure things out, to wait. Everything pulled back a little. And in that small step back, something began to shift. There's something interesting about energy. It doesn't always move the way logic expects it to. When you stop chasing, it doesn't mean you're losing an opportunity. It might mean you're giving everything room to breathe again. You create space that was once filled with effort, with unanswered questions, with the need to hold on to something that felt like it might slip away. And now, that space opens up, quietly, without needing validation, but wide enough for something else to begin forming. Space for someone else to feel your absence in a very different way. Not the kind of absence that tries to get attention, but something real. A natural withdrawal, where you're no longer placing yourself at the center of that story. And sometimes, that absence speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Because when you're no longer trying to be present in every moment of their life, they begin to notice just how much you were there before. A question may start to form, not in you, all but in them. What changed? And that question doesn't need your answer. Some answers only come when someone slows down on their own, looks back on their own, and finally faces a space they never paid attention to before. The silence now is no longer distance. It becomes a mirror, reflecting what once existed, what was once taken for granted, and maybe what was never fully seen. You don't need to say more. You don't need to explain further. You don't even need to know whether they truly understand or not, because what's changing isn't about convincing anyone. It's about no longer needing to. You begin to show up differently, not to be noticed, not to be validated, but simply to be yourself, lighter, more natural, without forcing anything. And maybe it's in that subtle shift, when you stop trying to hold everything in place, that things begin to return to where they truly belong. Not because you pulled them back, but because you let go. And within that letting go, a new direction starts to form. There's no need to rush into understanding it, no need to define it right away. Just recognize this. When you stop chasing, the story doesn't end. It simply begins to unfold in a different way. After all those quiet moments, something begins to surface. Not rushed, not immediately clear, but enough for you to feel that a different kind of shift is unfolding. Realizations rarely arrive at the moment we expect, and they almost never come in the way we imagined. There are things that while we still have them, we don't fully see, not because they're ignored on purpose. Yes, but sometimes it's simply because they've become familiar with your presence, familiar with the way you were always there, without needing to be named, without needing to be acknowledged. And that familiarity quietly turns something meaningful into something taken for granted. And when something is taken for granted for too long, people stop looking deeply at it. Until distance appears, not always as a clear separation, just a subtle space where your presence no longer sits in the same place it used to. And within that space, a different perspective begins to form. People start to notice what once passed by without attention. The small details, the quiet ways you cared, the times you stayed, even when you may have had every reason to leave. And maybe it takes distance for someone to finally have enough room to look back at those things, not to regret, not to return to the past, but simply to understand more clearly what was once there. And if, at this moment, you can feel that the way they see you is slowly beginning to shift, it doesn't necessarily mean you've become better by some standard. And it's not because you did something different to impress them. Maybe they're just seeing you from a new perspective, one no longer covered by old familiarity, one with more space to feel, to reflect, to notice what wasn't fully seen before. And what's important here is you don't have to do anything to make that happen. You don't have to return to prove your worth. You don't have to repeat what you once gave. Because what truly matters doesn't need to be repeated to become clearer. It only needs enough time and enough quiet distance to reveal itself. Maybe this realization comes slowly, slower than you once hoped, but slow doesn't mean meaningless, because there are things that if they come too early, won't be understood deeply enough. Only after someone walks their own path can they look back with a different kind of maturity, and somewhere along the way, you may begin to realize you no longer need to wait for someone else to figure it out. Because through that entire journey, what mattered most was never how they saw you, but how you learned to finally see yourself more clearly. And once that happens, any recognition from the outside, whether it comes early or late, becomes just a small part of a much larger story, the one you're now living. And then, after everything you've been through, something becomes clearer, not about them, but about you. The story now is no longer centered around who might come back, who will say what, or how things are going to unfold. It's about where you stand in your own journey. There was a version of you before, a version that waited for a message, waited for a sign, waited for an explanation clear enough to feel at ease again, to believe everything was still there. That version of you was real. It loved with sincerity. It tried to understand, to hold on, to stay just a little longer, even when things started to feel unclear. But now, something is different. You're no longer standing in that same place. Not because you've become colder, not because you've lost your ability to feel, but because you've learned to place yourself in a different position, a place where you don't need to wait for someone else to confirm your worth. You're no longer the one trying to read between the lines of someone else's silence, searching for hidden meaning. No longer the one overthinking what was never clearly said. Instead, you begin to listen to yourself more. You notice how you feel when you're around someone. You notice the sense of peace, or the absence of it, in even the smallest interactions. And what's interesting is, once you start doing that, things begin to feel clearer, without so much effort. You're still you, still deep, still sensitive to the smallest shifts in a connection. But this time, there's something more, a sense of steadiness. A steadiness that doesn't need to be proven, doesn't need to be shown. It's simply there, like someone standing on the shore after walking through a heavy wave, not needing to say they're strong, just standing there is enough to feel the difference. And if, at some point, someone returns with a different energy, a different approach, a different level of awareness, then the biggest change isn't in them. It's in how you receive it. You don't open your heart the same way you used to. Not because you've closed yourself off, but because you now understand what truly fits you. You don't rush to believe new signals. You don't rush to rebuild trust just because things seem different. You observe, you feel, and you allow things to unfold without forcing them into something defined. Because this time, you're no longer afraid of losing something. You simply don't want to lose yourself again. And maybe that's the real shift. Not about whether someone comes back or not about who was right or who was wrong, but about how you've moved into a different place in your own life. A place where you no longer have to hold on to something just to feel whole. And from that place, whatever comes next will be met with a calmness, a clarity, and a respect for yourself that, at one time, you may have forgotten. And then, when everything is settled long enough, a different perspective begins to appear. Not loud, not needing to be named right away, and yet, it carries a quiet clarity from within. Maybe this story, all along, was never really about whether someone would return or not. It's not an old cycle starting over again. It's not an ending being rewritten. It's a shift in how you exist within your own story. You begin to realize the way others see you often reflects how you've been seeing yourself. Not in the sense that if you change, others are forced to change. But when you become clearer with yourself, what no longer fits becomes easier to recognize. And what truly connects begins to feel different too. You don't need to force what happens next. You don't need to define what this connection is, where it's going, or where it should belong in your life. Because some things, the more quickly you try to name them, the more easily you lose their original essence. Instead, you allow things to exist as they are. Naturally, you observe, you feel, and you hold just enough space within yourself so you're not pulled back into old expectations. The biggest shift now isn't in what the other person is doing. It's in the way you no longer need to react the way you once did. You're no longer searching for external validation just to feel at ease. You're no longer letting your emotions depend entirely on how someone else shows up. Instead, you begin to stand more firmly in your own world, a world that doesn't shut others out, but also doesn't lose itself just to keep someone there. And if, in a moment, you notice that someone is starting to see you differently, it may not be a sign that needs to be decoded right away. It's not necessarily a promise of what will happen next. Maybe it's simply a reflection of the way you've started to see yourself more clearly, to value yourself more, and no longer feel willing to trade your inner peace for something that may not truly belong to you. You're stepping into a different layer now, not higher in comparison, but deeper in experience, a place where you no longer need to understand everything right away to feel safe, where you don't need a clear ending to feel whole. You just need to know you are here in your own journey with a different awareness, a different rhythm, and a calmness you may have never touched before. And maybe that's what matters most. Not whether someone comes back, not where this story will go, but that you're no longer where you used to be. You've moved through a part of yourself that once felt so familiar, and into a version of you that is quieter, clearer, and more real. And from here, whatever continues to enter your life will be received not from a place of lack, but from a place of wholeness. Not from anxiety, but from a quiet trust that you can listen, you can choose, and you can walk away if needed, without losing yourself again. And if there's one thing you can hold on to after everything you've been through, maybe it's this feeling. You don't have to go back to where you once were to understand how much you've grown. You only need to look at the way you keep moving forward, and that's enough.